There is a car driving down a road right now, somewhere in California, or Arizona, or Texas. No human behind the wheel. Just sensors, cameras, and code. And buried inside that code, inside every self-driving car operating on public roads today, is an answer to a question that philosophers spent 60 years arguing could never be answered. Who do you kill when someone has to die? Here is the scenario. Your self-driving car is moving at highway speed. A brake failure. The road ahead splits. On the left, 5 pedestrians crossing on a green light. On the right, 1 pedestrian crossing on red. The car has 0.3 seconds. You are not in control. The algorithm is. And the algorithm has already decided. Not in the moment of the crash. Not reactively. It was decided months ago by engineers in a conference room, based on ethical frameworks chosen by people you've never met, approved by lawyers thinking about liability, reviewed by regulators thinking about policy. The trolley problem, the most famous thought experiment in the history of philosophy, was supposed to be hypothetical. It was invented in 1967 to help philosophers think about abortion law. It is now a line of code in a vehicle traveling at 70 miles per hour. This is the story of how an abstract classroom question became one of the most consequential engineering decisions of the 21st century. And why the answer every company quietly chose reveals something deeply uncomfortable about what we actually believe versus what we say we believe about the value of a human life. The trolley problem was first created by philosopher Philippa Foot and published in 1967 in a paper called The Problem of Abortion and the Doctrine of the Double Effect. Note what she was actually writing about. Abortion. Not trolleys. Not runaway trains. She was trying to understand the Catholic doctrine of double effect, the theological principle that says an action with both a good and a bad consequence can be morally permissible, so long as the bad consequence was not the intended outcome. She needed an example. A clean, stripped-down scenario with no religious or political baggage, where the logic could be examined without distraction. Foot's scenario is this. The driver of a runaway trolley has a choice. Stay on the current track or steer onto a side track. 5 men are working on one track, and 1 man is working on the other. The driver's choice will kill either 5 men or 1 man. That's it. That was the whole thing. A footnote in a paper about abortion. We should note that Foot presented this thought experiment as one among many others, and there is no evident reason why this one has received so much attention from the philosophical and scientific communities. She couldn't have known. Nobody could have known. Because, for the next decade, the trolley problem was just a philosophy seminar exercise. Students argued about it. Professors assigned it. It generated papers. It generated counterpapers. And then in 1976, 9 years after Foot's original, philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson wrote a paper called Killing, Letting Die, and the Trolley Problem, in which she introduced a second version that made everything more complicated. Thomson's version is called the footbridge scenario, and it changed everything. George is on a footbridge over the trolley tracks. He knows trolleys and can see that the one approaching the bridge is out of control. On the track back of the bridge there are 5 people. The banks are so steep that they will not be able to get off the track in time. George knows that the only way to stop an out-of-control trolley is to drop a very heavy weight into its path. But the only available, sufficiently heavy weight is a fat man also watching the trolley from the footbridge. George can shove the fat man onto the track in the path of the trolley, killing the fat man, or he can refrain from doing this, letting the 5 die. Now, here is what is strange. In Foot's original version, the lever, the vast majority of people say pull the lever. Kill 1, save 5 twart. The math is clear. 5 is more than 1. In Thomson's footbridge version, the vast majority of people say, do not push the man. Even though the math is identical. One person dies either way. 5 people are saved either way. The numbers are exactly the same. The outcomes are exactly the same. And yet, people feel completely differently about the two scenarios. The vast majority of people pulled the lever in the original version, but refused to push the fat man in the second version. Why? That question, why the numbers are the same, but the feeling is different, is what drove 60 years of philosophical research. And it is also the question that revealed something that the engineers of self-driving cars were not prepared to discover. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, something new happened to the trolley problem. Scientists with brain scanners started using it. Psychologists and neuroscientists discovered that the trolley problem wasn't just a philosophical puzzle. It was a probe, a tool for looking inside the human moral system and watching it work. What they found was not comforting. When people consider Foot's lever scenario, impersonal, mechanical, one decision removes you from the death, the brain regions that activate are primarily in the prefrontal cortex. The reasoning centers, the calculation machinery, part of the brain that does math. When people consider Thomson's footbridge scenario, personal, physical, your hands pushing a man to his death, something different activates. The emotional centers, the regions associated with disgust, empathy, and personal violation. Same arithmetic, different brain systems. What this meant was profound and troubling. It meant that human moral intuition is not a consistent system. It is two systems fighting each other. One system calculates consequences, 5 is more than 1, save the 5. The other system responds to physical and social context. I cannot put my hands on a man and push him to his death. Neither system is correct. Neither is irrational. They evolve for different purposes, and they conflict. And this discovery, that human morality is not a unified calculator, but a collection of competing emotional and rational systems, is precisely the problem that every autonomous vehicle engineer now has to solve. Because a self-driving car has no emotional centers. It has no disgust response. It has no feeling about the difference between pulling a lever and pushing a man. It has only code. And code has to make a choice. For decades, the trolley problem existed entirely in seminar rooms and philosophy journals. Then, quietly, it moved. The exact moment is hard to pin down. Sometime in the early 2010s, as self-driving car technology began to move from research projects to commercial products, as Google's Waymo and Tesla and Uber and dozens of others began putting autonomous vehicles on public roads, engineers began encountering a question they had not expected to encounter. What does the car do when someone has to die? Engineers must program vehicles to make ethical decisions in life or death situations, such as choosing between protecting a passenger or a pedestrian. But how can a machine's software make such personal decisions? At first, many in the industry tried to dismiss the question. In the real world, Waymo, Cruise, or Tesla, or any other company are not engineering their self-driving vehicles to decide who lives and dies in the event of an accident. This statement is technically true. No company has a subroutine labeled trolley problem. No engineer writes code that says, compare the ages of the people in the vehicle versus the pedestrians and select accordingly. But the dismissal is misleading, because the choice is not made explicitly. It is made implicitly. When you program a vehicle to prioritize minimizing harm, you have made a choice. When you program it to protect the passenger above all else, you have made a different choice. When you program it to brake rather than swerve, you have made a third choice. Self-driving cars have no morality or intuition. Self-driving cars have never pondered the trolley problem. But these advanced machines will have to make lightning-fast decisions about life and death. The trolley problem did not disappear because engineers preferred not to think about it. It became embedded in every line of collision avoidance code ever written. In 2014, a group of researchers at the MIT Media Lab decided to do something radical. They took the trolley problem out of the seminar room and gave it to the internet. They built a platform called the moral machine. The concept was simple. Present people with variations of the trolley scenario adapted for self-driving cars. A vehicle with brake failure. Different groups of people in its path. Ask, what should the car do? In 2014, researchers at the MIT Media Lab designed an experiment called Moral Machine, a game-like platform that would crowdsource people's decisions on how self-driving cars should prioritize lives in different variations of the trolley problem. They never expected what happened next. 4 years after the platform went live, millions of people in 233 countries and territories had logged 40 million decisions, making it one of the largest studies ever done on global moral preferences. 40 million decisions from 233 countries, covering 9 different moral comparisons: humans versus pet, passengers versus pedestrians, more lives versus fewer, women versus men, young versus old, fit versus less fit, higher social status versus lower, law-abiders versus jaywalkers, and should the car swerve or stay on course. The scale was unprecedented. The results were more complicated than anyone expected. Some findings were relatively consistent globally. 3 elements that people seem to approve of the most: save more lives over fewer, protect humans over animals, prioritize children over the elderly. But when researchers dug into cultural differences, the picture fractured. A new paper published in Nature presents the analysis of that data and reveals how much cross-cultural ethics diverge on the basis of culture, economics, and geographic location. The researchers defined Western, Eastern, and Southern clusters of countries and found pronounced variations along these lines. Respondents in Southern countries had a relatively stronger tendency to favor sparing young people rather than the elderly, especially compared to the Eastern cluster. In other words, what counts as the morally correct answer to the trolley problem depends significantly on where you were born. This is a problem that has no clean solution, because a self-driving car sold in Germany will also drive in France. Cars sold in the United States will be driven by people with radically different moral frameworks. The moral machine data revealed that there is no universal trolley answer. There is no globally agreed upon hierarchy of human lives. And yet, someone has to choose. Here is what most coverage of self-driving car ethics misses. Companies did answer the trolley problem. Not openly. No. Not in press releases or ethics manifestos. Quietly, implicitly, in ways that are only visible if you know where to look. With very rare exceptions, automakers are famously coy about crash dilemmas. They don't want to answer questions about how their self-driving cars would respond to weird, no-win emergencies. This is understandable, since any answer can be criticized. There's no obvious solution to a true dilemma, so why play that losing game? But we can divine how an automaker approaches these hypothetical problems by looking at patent filings, actual behavior in related situations, and other clues. One answer became clear very quickly. Almost universally, Western self-driving car manufacturers defaulted to what is called the minimize harm framework. In a crash scenario where someone will be hit, the vehicle is programmed to minimize total damage, to brake hard rather than swerve into a group, to reduce speed, to choose the least harmful outcome available. This sounds reasonable, but it conceals a choice. When a car is programmed to minimize total harm, and total harm is measured in lives, then in a scenario with 5 people on one side and 1 on the other, the car will choose the one, without knowing who they are. without knowing if the 5 people jaywalk, without knowing if the one person is pregnant, or elderly, or a child, or a doctor running to an emergency. The car does math. The moral machine data showed that most humans don't just do math. And then there was Mercedes-Benz. In 2016, a Mercedes representative made a statement that created an international firestorm. He said that Mercedes vehicles would be programmed to protect the occupants of the car above all else. In a collision scenario, the vehicle would prioritize the safety of the people inside it. The logic from a business perspective was almost audible. If you are going to buy a self-driving car, you want to know it will try to protect you. If the car might sacrifice you to save strangers, you will not buy it. The moral backlash was immediate and severe. Critics pointed out that this was essentially programming cars to treat their passengers as worth more than pedestrians, to encode social hierarchy into collision decisions, to say, the person who paid for the car matters more than the person crossing the street. Mercedes later walked back the statement. But the problem it exposed did not go away. While companies were quietly avoiding the question, one government decided to answer it directly. Germany's Ethics Committee on Automated Driving stressed that self-driving cars must do the least amount of harm if put into a situation where hitting a human is unavoidable and cannot discriminate based on age, gender, race, disability, or any other observable factors. In other words, all self-driving cars must be programmed to understand that human life is equal. The 2021 German Act on Autonomous Driving provided that motor vehicles with an autonomous driving function must have an accident avoidance system that protects human life with highest priority, and in the case of unavoidable alternative harm to human life, does not provide for further weighting on the basis of personal characteristics. In plain English, German law says that a self-driving car cannot decide that an elderly person is worth less than a child, cannot decide that a homeless person is worth less than a doctor, cannot look at the people in its path and rank them. All human lives, in the eyes of German autonomous driving law, are equal. This sounds right. It sounds like the correct moral position. But it creates a new problem that the law does not solve. If you cannot discriminate between individuals, cannot weight one life against another, then what do you do when someone must die? If you cannot say save the child over the elderly person, what principle guides the vehicle's decision? The answer Germany effectively chose is this: minimize total numbers. Save more people when you can. When the numbers are equal, when it is 1 against 1, randomize. Or brake. Or do whatever reduces speed fastest. Which is itself a moral choice. It just looks more neutral than it is. Here is the thing that 60 years of philosophical research, neuroscience experiments, and 40 million moral machine responses have revealed. The trolley problem is not actually about trolleys. It is about the gap between what we believe and what we do, between the moral frameworks we endorse in conversation and the instincts that guide us when we have to act. Most people, when asked in the abstract, say they are utilitarian. Save the most lives. 5/1 to 1. The math is simple. Of course, you pull the lever. But in the footbridge scenario, push the man, the same people freeze. The math is still 5/1. And they cannot do it. Thompson exposed that morality is not a calculator, but a sensorium. We feel our ethics before we think them. And this is the problem that self-driving car engineers discovered when they tried to encode human morality into code. There is no consistent human morality to encode. We are utilitarian in principle and deontological in practice. We say save the most lives, and then refuse to push the man. We say all lives are equal, and then check the ages and genders in the moral machine experiment. We say morality is universal and then reveal in 40 million data points that it varies enormously by culture. The trolley problem forces all of this into the open. It holds a mirror up to the gap between what we say we believe and what we actually believe. And now, for the first time in human history, we have built machines that must resolve that gap. That cannot exist in the comfortable ambiguity that human moral life inhabits. That must, in 0.3 seconds, based on sensor data and code written months earlier, make a choice that humans have refused to make for 60 years. There is a criticism of the trolley problem that is worth taking seriously. The trolley problem has absolutely nothing to do with how autonomous driving systems actually work. Anybody who trots it out is simply revealing how little they understand the technology involved. This argument says, real crashes are not trolley problems. Real crashes are chaotic, unpredictable, multivariable events in which no algorithm is making a clean choice between 5 people and 1 person. The scenario is too stylized, too clean. Real life is messier. There is truth in this. But the argument misses something important. The trolley problem is not valuable because it maps precisely onto real crash scenarios. It is valuable because it isolates a moral question that real crash scenarios obscure with complexity. It asks, when you must choose, what do you choose? And why? That question does not disappear because real crashes are messy. It gets harder, and the engineers who build the code that governs real crashes, who decide whether a vehicle prioritizes braking over swerving, whether it protects passengers or minimizes total damage, whether it behaves differently in a school zone than on a highway. Those engineers are answering the trolley question. They are just answering it without calling it that. The traditional trolley problem disregards who is morally and legally responsible for road accidents, although these facts are essential. Furthermore, the traditional trolley problem ignores special obligations, such as an automobile manufacturer's duty to protect its customers. This is the real complexity. The trolley problem, as Foot originally posed it, has a single decision maker with no special obligations. The self-driving car problem has manufacturers who owe duties to their customers, regulators who owe duties to the public, engineers who owe professional responsibilities, and governments that owe duties to their citizens. Every one of these parties has a stake in the answer, and every one of them has been mostly trying not to answer it out loud. The trolley problem, introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967, was a thought experiment designed to challenge moral decision-making. She introduced it, as a footnote, to think about abortion law. In a paper that most people have never read, millions of users from 233 countries and territories took the quiz, making 40 million ethical decisions in total. 40 million people answered the question she raised in a footnote, and found collectively that there is no answer everyone agrees on. And right now, on roads in California and Texas and Arizona and Shanghai and Munich, on roads where people walk and cross and exist, vehicles are driving autonomously, sensing the world, processing data, ready to make decisions that no one in the vehicles is making. The trolley problem is not hypothetical anymore. It never really was. Because the question behind the trolley, the question that Foot was actually asking in 1967, in the paper about abortion and double effect, is this. When action has consequences you did not intend, are you responsible for them? When the algorithm your company wrote makes a choice at 70 miles per hour, and someone dies, and the choice was made months ago by engineers who will never know whose name was on the other end of that decision. Who pulled the lever? And here is the question that does not have an answer yet. The one that every government, every company, and every passenger in every autonomous vehicle is quietly living inside. If you knew, before you got in the car, exactly what hierarchy of lives the algorithm had chosen, whose life it would protect and whose it would sacrifice, would you still get in? Think carefully, because someone already answered that question for you.